Welcome, everyone. Excited to welcome you to this discussion during National Apprenticeship Week on building a national infrastructure for early educator apprenticeship. I'm Leah Austin. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Equity in Early Ed Systems Reform. It's a consulting venture where I really have the opportunity to bring my experience in ECE research, policy, advocacy, and systems to work directly with partners and communities, developing and implementing strategies that ultimately make caring for and teaching young children a good job for early educators. And I'm super pleased to introduce Dr. Randy Wolf. Randy has spent more than 40 years in ECE. Starting out, she's been a preschool teacher. She served as a child care center director, a family support center director. Following those experiences, she joined Northern Illinois University, where she was an associate professor of early childhood education, I believe, for nearly 2 decades. And then she came to California, which is where I'm based. And since moving to California, Randy has really focused on large scale workforce development initiatives in ECE, bringing together diverse stakeholders and really working to strengthen systems that support early care and education and the workforce specifically. In 2019, Randy founded Early Care and Education Pathways to Success, or ESEPS, which has become widely recognized for its leadership in developing registered apprenticeships in the ECE workforce. And fairly recently, from 2022 to 2025, she served on the U.S. Secretary of Labor's Advisory Committee on Apprenticeship, really helping to shape national conversations around apprenticeship programs, again, specifically for early educators. And as the host of ESEP's podcast, Early Care and Education, All Things Workforce, Randy is usually the one putting people, including myself, in the hot seat and peppering them with questions. But today it's Randy's turn to get in that hot seat. So we're going to treat today's session as a bit of an interview conversation between Randy and I, kind of pick her brain and experience with apprenticeship. So before we get going, just a little bit of housekeeping. We do have the chat feature on. If there's something we need to share or announce out, we'll do so. If participants, you have some thoughts or chats you want to share with each other, feel free to put those in there. But in kind of the spirit of the interview conversation dialogue here where it's not going to be a monitored or tightly monitored chat. So just want to make sure folks know that. And I think with that, we are ready to jump in and put Randy on the hot seat. So welcome, Randy.
Thank you, Leah. I'm glad to
Um,
be here.
Excellent. Well, I hope you enjoy this experience as much as we do on the other side, usually. So I want to start, as Randy, of course, knows, but everybody might not be aware. Last year, my colleagues and I, when I was at the Center for the Study of Child Care Employment, we released a paper about ESEPS, and specifically the ESEPS journey from its founding in 2019 to the role today of really shaping a national conversation and building infrastructure on early educator and around early educator apprenticeship. And in that paper, we discuss what our team had identified as the ESEP secret sauce, which really are principles that are driving the work of ESEPs. And there's several of them, but there are things like building community and relationships, continuous improvement, adaptability, growing your own approaches to staffing and learning. Um, and so, Randy, I'm curious, and I think people would like to know, you've spent all of this time in this sector as a teacher, you've been a professor, an advocate. Um, what was it about the specific mechanism of registered apprenticeship that really sparked your conviction that it was a missing piece for ECE? And how did those early experiences in the field that you're bringing to this work really shape the secret sauce that's driving the work of ESEPs and the supports that you embed in your workforce models for the workforce?
Thanks, Leah. It's a really important question, and it's a good place to start because it's not that I just woke up one day and said, "Oh, I got an idea." Everything that we've done in the last 10, 11 years was built on the shoulders of everything I've done. And what we've done is sort of a different story, but what I've done is built on the shoulders of what had come before. So two things in particular, I think, informed the initial idea and concept when we heard about this notion of using apprenticeships as a professional development model. And the first is I was, as you said, I was a professor at Northern Illinois University for 10 years, actually, not 20, but still a long time. And one of the things that I was doing there, I was in charge of all the student teacher placements. So I went out and saw all the schools and I, worked with the cooperating teachers and all that. Northern Illinois University is located about 60 miles west of Chicago. So most of the students came from small towns, farms, rural areas. And when I got there, all the practicum and student teaching took place at the Campus Child Development Center, which is fine, but it meant it was all children of faculty and community members in the city where the university was. And there wasn't a huge amount of diversity among the students, even though we were close to Chicago. So I shifted all of the field placements to Rockford. Rockford is very much like Chicago, except it's a little smaller. And it meant that all the students were going to be placed, especially in student teaching, in very diverse environments, and some of them in very tough neighborhoods. And what I said to the students who, when we first made this change, they were nervous. And what I said to them is, let me explain something to you. When you go to a job interview and you tell them you did your student teaching, at a suburban school that was well resourced and all the children, were well prepared from the time they were born, the principal is going to go, oh, that's interesting. But when you tell them you've done your student teaching in Rockford and what that means you learned, then a principal is going to go, all right, this is the teacher I'm looking for. And that idea, I think, came with me when I came to California. Although I think that I didn't need to give the message, I think people automatically assumed that message, but I knew something about what it meant to put that into action. So that was sort of number one. Then number two, when I got to LA, for 4 years, I worked for an organization called Los Angeles Universal Preschool. And we built this program that involved six community colleges and 5 universities across LA County. And it was a pipeline project. And we took students and we were trying to get them to get more and more advanced credentials and to make the transition from getting an AA to getting a BA. The missing piece was employers. But the notion of what does it mean to build pipeline projects and what does it mean to work with multi-employers and how do you build relationships so people trust you enough to actually say, yeah, let's try this. And also feel comfortable enough to say what's not working and what could be better. All of that was like a learning lab for what came later when we understood this model and what it took to make it work. Let me stop there for now.
Thank you, Randy. And I want to ask a follow-up specifically about the LA project because I had the opportunity when I was at the center, we did a study of the projects, which I think were called Wi-Fi. It was the LA Up Wi-Fi Workforce
We called it
Initiative.
the Wi-Fi Project, which stood for Workforce, uh, golly, okay, I can't remember. I remember there was no Workforce, I can't remember what the F stood for. Something initiative. Oh, Workforce, WF, Workforce Initiative, right?
Yes,
Even though there was no I as in Wi-Fi, but if you just do WFI, you can't pronounce it.
it was catchy.
Therefore, we called it a Wi-Fi project.
Yes,
Little did we know that would make us sound like we knew something about tech
about tech,
years later.
not quite. Um, and so one of the findings, or a couple of the findings that came out of that study that were super interesting. So this was the study we called From Aspiration to Attainment. And there were 2 pieces in particular that the students, so we did surveys and interviews with students at the community colleges that they were really struggling with. And so as you said, the employers were the missing piece or a really important missing piece. And we found, probably not surprising to many of the folks on the call today, that for students who were also working adults, they were working in ECE programs. Many, of course, have their own families and all of the things that reflect who our early educators are. were really struggling because they didn't have work arrangements that were supportive, or even if they were, it was still really difficult for their employer to shift their schedule every semester so they could get out of class on time to get all the way across LA traffic to get to their classes, right? And so many of the students stalled and they weren't continuing to take classes because this was a barrier for them. From a college perspective, they were often seen as kind of dropouts. They were gone. The students hardly ever defined themselves at that. They really were like, it just takes me one class a year because that's all I can arrange. So I'm wondering, in this employers being the missing piece here, could you say a little bit more about like what does that mean and what does that mean in relationship to ESEPs and apprenticeship models?
Sure. And really, when you say it, in shorthand, we say the employers were the missing piece. It would be more accurate to say the on-the-job training was the missing piece. The mentoring was the missing piece, and building the connection between the colleges and the employers was the missing piece. And putting all that into place is part of simply meeting the five required elements of an apprenticeship program, which is part of why this whole thing works. So I'm not going to belabor that, but I'll mention it very quickly because it addresses what you're talking about. The first thing is there's no such thing as an unpaid apprentice. It's not like an internship. So for students who can't afford to go to school and have a job over here that has nothing to do with going to school, but it pays the bills, it sustains the family. That's an unworkable, situation if you're really trying to move people forward. But if from day one as an apprentice you are paid, you are employed, you are a W-2 employee and you have benefits, then adding school to that, it becomes a much simpler, not simple, but simpler undertaking. Number two, like I said, the on-the-job training, it's not just a job. It's supervised, it's mentored. Somebody is tracking you. We are watching to make sure you're going to succeed. If you start to slip through the cracks, we're going to catch you. That's a very different environment than just being thrown into a job and figuring it out or not. Then, if you connect that with the college experience, instead of seeing it as two different things, big changes happen. Number one, in an apprenticeship program, ideally, no apprentice is paying to be part of that program. If you're trying to encourage ECE workers, given who we serve, to get BA degrees and think that they can go to a university where they're going to come out with a BA and $75,000 in debt or whatever it is these days, think again. And so by having a program where you are not only paid and supervised and trained, but also you got college coursework at no cost, textbooks at no cost, a laptop at no cost. These are the game changers in the design of registered apprenticeship. And then how we breathe life into that design is sort of the frosting on the cake.
And I'm just curious if you could say a little bit more, kind of on that, the frosting on the cake and bringing these supports together, because I think, um, you know, traditionally, apprenticeship, as people tend to think about it, right? They're built on what have been, male-dominated trades. They often have connections to unions. They're working with, jobs and employers that have certainly higher margins. And so you have a wage scale that has more substantial wages than can be found in ECE at this point in time because of, we're just so chronically underfunded. And of course, we're a sector that's primarily powered by the labor of women and often women of color. And we know, what comes with the exploitation of their labor, right? And I know I've certainly been in conversations where, uh, you kind of people raise their eyebrows about like, well, is this apprenticeship if you don't have those other things, if you don't necessarily have the wage increases in the same way that you might see in other sectors, or perhaps the stronger unions or labor protections in the same way. Um, but part of what I hear you describing is there are these other benefits. Those are certainly benefits, and we would like to realize those, but there are these other benefits that are characteristics of apprenticeship, right? As you're saying, the on-the-job training, you're not paying for the resources, those are being paid elsewhere. Um, so I'm just wondering if you could maybe build a little bit on like the icing on the cake and um, some of how we don't lose some of the rigor of traditional apprenticeships when we continue to be under-resourced and don't quite have the wage scales, for example, in place.
So I think if we focus only on the wages, then we sort of miss the boat. And we may want to come back to that later. We'll see how time goes. But what I would say is, I guess I'd say a couple things. One is um, within early educator apprenticeships, folks do get wage increases. It's a requirement. So it's not that that's ignored. How much of a wage increase is basically, reliant on what the employer can handle. But it's not like we ignore that. The problem is that in the apprentice, I'm not sure if I'm going to go off on a tangent you didn't mean to go on to, so you'll have to reel me back if that's the case. The problem isn't how the ECE apprenticeships work. The problem is how ECE apprenticeships are treated or viewed in the larger apprenticeship system, and then what happens, what the battles are because of that. Is that is that where we're heading? Is that
We can definitely head there. Yes.
okay? Okay.
I think I
Okay.
was gonna head there a little later, but let's head there. We can head there now for sure.
Okay. Um, so I guess despite what I said, you can't avoid the issue of wages. So let me just sort of jump on that one, and then we'll go on. Maybe then we'll go back to other things. The biggest thing, and you already sort of said it, is that the apprenticeship. Let me back up. The apprenticeship system is about jobs. The U.S. Department of Labor apprenticeship system is about job training, employment. It is not actually about empowerment. It's not about professional development. It's about get people a job and get them the best paying job they can get for as little training as possible. That is not, and of course, ECE, we defy the rules of, economics in so many ways. For one thing, we completely defy the rules of supply and demand. There is a huge demand, there is not enough supply, and it has nothing to do with the demand. Things like that, right? And likewise, what we're paid is so unreflective of the value of the work and the skill required to do the work. But the biggest bias we face is other people's assumptions and misconceptions that A, we're babysitters and therefore low skilled, that B, these are not quality jobs. Those are the two biggest things, right? So the way I think about it is we can't just build ECE apprenticeships. We have to be doing systems change and advocacy as much as we're doing program development and implementation because we have to change the conversation. And I will say, it's not like we're at the beginning of that road anymore. We are really deep in the road. We're like crossing under bridges and, going on off ramps and on ramps and whatever. High speed rail, maybe, is the best analogy. Okay, all of that said, the thing about apprenticeship that became so valuable for our workforce is, like I said, it's not just what the apprenticeship structure permits, but what we did with it. So anybody in this call probably knows that at ESEPS, we take centering equity very seriously. And what that has meant is we look at every aspect of everything we're doing and we think about where does equity fit in? Where does access fit in? So that ends up being not a small conversation. In a typical apprenticeship, somebody finds you and they go, "Oh, you need a job. There's this apprenticeship. Here, sign this form. Go talk to that person. They'll tell you what courses to take." And that's the end of it. We take people in through the door of our partnerships, not directly by ESEPs, and then we embrace them. through their first certificate, through their AA degree, through their BA degree. People stay in touch even after they're no longer in the apprenticeship because we see it as a long-term investment. So we figured out early on access is equity. If you are offering classes at 1 to 2:30 every Tuesday and Thursday to a bunch of people who are working full time, it is unworkable. If you are offering classes of 40 students at the community college to students who are first generation college students or returning students or students for whom English is not their first language, so forth and so on, it's just too big of a group. And I was a university professor for 10 years. I would not have wanted 40 freshmen, any kind of 40 freshmen in one class, and expect them to get the thoughtful, attentive responsiveness that they deserve and need. If you are offering classes at a college campus that's not accessible by public transportation, then you are not meeting the needs of the people you're trying to serve. And so that's what I mean when I say access becomes critical. And again, if you're charging people for tuition, if you're charging people to participate in a program, even the assumption that you could afford to do student teaching full time and not be paid for it is such a barrier to success for anybody who needs to be working for a living. So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
All right, I will second all of that on access. Absolutely, right? All of those barriers are just so critical, and we're probably going to circle back to that in a little bit. But I want to ask you about. I think you alluded to some of this in saying, ESUPS is deep on the road, right? Like you are there, you're under the bridges, over the bridges, and all of that.
High speed rail.
High speed rail, yes. And ESUPS has really moved from being a local sponsor of apprenticeship in California, which was kind of your first step in this work when ESUPS was founded, to a national industry intermediary and a field builder, as you're saying, like really helping people understand what this is, how to do it. Um, and I'm curious, specifically in the role of a industry intermediary and how that connects to field builder. And I'll just define for folks very briefly what an industry intermediary is, because there is a specific definition, as you said, like apprenticeship means something very specific as defined by the Department of Labor. And so an industry intermediary, just very briefly, has some flexibility in like the services and activities that you do, but around um, three central roles to that. So one is encouraging the rapid development and implementation of registered apprenticeships, providing technical assistance to develop standards, and then helping coordinate those local um, partners to leverage the relationships and resources and bring the funding and other partnerships together, and then supporting that pipeline, right? The apprenticeship pipeline. Um, and there are areas of the country and there are sectors where they don't have necessarily sector specific. You can have apprenticeship supports in a region that cross trades rather than ECE specific as the work you're doing. So how does that really matter when you talk about you know, being able to, dismantle some of those barriers, really talk about and identify the access challenges? Why is having that ECE specific lens on apprenticeship really critical, um, as opposed to kind of folding ECE apprenticeship into just some broader context or supports for apprenticeship pipelines?
Right. And this is a question that has a lot of bearing here in California, but it's absolutely an issue nationwide. There's this sort of debate, and it's sort of a one-sided debate. Should you have, it's clear that we're not going to be able to increase apprenticeships across the board in big numbers if there's not some way for people to learn this stuff. And you can't go to school and get a degree in apprenticeship, and it's very hard to find people who will help you and teach you and all that. So this thing of intermediaries kind of evolved. And I think the impression is it's easier to find a regional intermediary than it is to find a sector intermediary. But I'm not sure they actually even think it through. I think most people actually can't, don't even, it doesn't occur to them the idea of a sector intermediary. Again, if you think about what apprenticeship's about, it's all industries. They'll put a person in any industry that fits or any industry that happens to be where they live. And as you were talking, I thought, okay, here's the analogy. Imagine that all we had in the medical industry were general practitioners, and everybody had access to it. And even let's extend the analogy, and not even everyone had access to general practitioners. But if you happen to live in the right state or in the right city or under the right administration, everyone had access to general practitioners. That's fine. Except if you have heart disease, you really need a cardiologist. And if you're a horse, you really need a veterinarian. And if you have something wrong with your, molars, you really need a dentist or maybe even an endodontist. That's the analogy. So ESEPs came into this thing because it came through me, and I had spent already, 20, 30 years in ECE. I didn't come into apprenticeship and then discover ECE. I was in ECE and then discovered apprenticeship. So I came in with a certain sort of work culture assumption and values assumption and equity assumption. And I brought all that to the way I interpreted what I learned about apprenticeship. And my contention, and it has, borne out, is when you talk to a certain population of workers, they can tell in about 3 minutes if they know what they're talking about. Not in terms of what are the rules of apprenticeship, but in terms of who they are. I remember I was once we were doing like a recruitment event, and there were union people because that was part of who was sponsoring the thing. And the union people were great about talking about certain things. But when they started talking about the ins and outs of what they were about to offer them, you could tell, and the whole audience, they just could tell. Now, I got up, I hadn't been in California that long. I'd never worked in California as a preschool teacher. It didn't matter. I knew immediately who I was talking to, and you could tell they knew immediately that I understood who they were. So when you can bring to the table understanding of that workforce, the struggles they face, the strengths they bring to the table, and therefore, and also when you know enough about the barriers because you've either lived them or you've worked within them, then you can actually be an intermediary who doesn't just say, let me teach you apprenticeship, who says, let me help you make apprenticeship be successful in the world you live in, with the workers you're trying to engage, the employers you're trying to engage, and the strengths and challenges that brings to the table. And I don't think you get that if you're a generalist. If you know that expression, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. That's the other analogy, right? And we're dealing with, Phillips screws and fine, okay, I'm going to lose this analogy. All I know is you need a drill, you need a wrench, you need a lot of tools. Everything is not a nail.
That's right. That is true indeed. So given that, and as you were talking about, access and access really being key to an equity strategy. In ECE apprenticeship, I mean, you can see how that lends on really understanding the importance of who early educators are, how programs operate, uh, to make those connections on, how do you design then programs that do work for employers and work for educators, and oftentimes the higher ed systems, which are another partner in this, right? That are having to do things that maybe they haven't done before, or organize coursework and faculty in ways that they haven't. And it's also true that apprenticeship across industries, as well as professional preparation in ECE specifically, has a documented history of, or histories of exclusion, right? We know that there have been so many barriers and continue to be. So as we are moving to, broaden and make ECE apprenticeship, scale it and make it more accessible in more communities, how do we ensure that equity is operationalized as part of a program's infrastructure and it's not just a buzzword, or access isn't just a buzzword? Like, what's the brass tacks of that?
Um, Read me the la- I my I went on my thoughts. Read me the tell me again the last part of that question. I just make sure
Just
I
really like how do we ensure that equity is operationalized as part of the infrastructure of apprenticeship and it's not just a buzzword. So as you think about
right,
like, right, the standards and models, like what's
right.
critical, like what are you bringing or uh, working with communities to do as they're standing up
Yeah.
apprenticeship programs around this?
Right. Okay. Okay. So let me build off of what I sort of was talking about. So access as a strategy, access as a strategy to equity is a big part of that. Once programs are fully accessible, you you know, we go into communities where people say, well, we don't know how to recruit those folks aren't the ones who apply for the program. And then we say, well, how are you advertising your program? There was a particular community where we said, but you didn't put up flyers in the laundromat and you didn't put up flyers at the WIC office. So, you have to think about where are you advertising? Where are you recruiting? Are you recruiting from the unemployed parents that are your Head Start, the parents of your Head Start students? So it's like every single aspect of everything has to be thought through that lens. One of the things, it's sort of an offshoot if people are building apprenticeships for people who would succeed at college, easily succeed at college, or who assume they'd be college bound and don't really need supports, extra supports, that's not who apprenticeship is supposed to be for. And there are industries where that is who they're building the apprenticeships for. It's basically it's a alternative pathway, meaning you don't have to go to college, but you can still get this great job. I'm trying, I don't want to name names of specific sectors, but I know this goes on. So we have said many times to funders and to anyone else we're talking to, we don't work in communities that don't need our help and assistance. And I don't mean that in a disempowering way. It's quite the opposite. But that's a big issue. In other words, when you decide who your workforce, who is your target audience, that's the first step about equity. There was I'll give you a really good example. There was someone I know, I'm not going to name the state or the organization, but it wasn't California. And he was trying to explain to me he was trying to really impress me with this, I don't know, it was advanced manufacturing, I think, or something like that. And so he went on and on and on. And then I finally said, well, how many apprentices do you have? Because I thought there must be hundreds the way he was talking. And he said 14. Okay. All right. So, you're a little insecure. That's fine. And then I said, and what are the demographics of your group? And he said, before he even answered the question, he said, well, you have to understand for those students, this was youth apprenticeship in particular, high school students, for those students to be able to get to where this employer is, some massive manufacturing plant, it would take them 2 hours by public transportation. So we really can't reach out. So we really reach out to the community right around who's, easy access to the plant. And I said, well, why are you doing that? Then why is that the employer you're working with? Because either you have to figure this out or find an advanced manufacturer who lives where your people live. And so again, it's like when you decide who you're reaching out to, that sort of paves the way for a lot of the other things that come later. Okay, so that's that piece of it. Um, but I guess the other thing then gets to what is the actual nitty gritty of how you design a program. Like we always say to people, apprenticeship is not magic. The magic is in how you design and implement and deliver your program. And that gets to the real nitty gritty. We have this slide, which we're not going to go over today, but there's sort of 4 elements of what we think of as the walking the walk of equity. You have to have no cost to participants. That includes everything from tuition to textbooks to permit applications to if they have to pay to get their blood test, in order to get their certification or background check. Then there's dedicated program staff. Most apprenticeships in other industries, they don't have program staff. You just sign up and you do this thing. We have sort of invented this role called success coordinator. It is not a case manager and it's not a mentor. It's the person who really knows that apprentice and knows if they didn't show up to class, there's a reason and we better call and find out what it is. Or there was this sort of sad but wonderful story. An apprentice didn't show up, and the success coordinator knew that was really unusual. And the mom had I think it was twin 3 year olds. And the day of class, it was pouring rain, and she didn't have a stroller, and there was no way for her to get to the bus. So she told this to the success coordinator after she'd missed the class, right? And so the success coordinator went to like a Goodwill or something and for very few dollars found her a stroller and solved the problem. So it's that level of I'm there for you. I'm going to help you. You can trust me. We're going to make this work. And you're saying this to people who have never had someone say that, almost the opposite. The message has been you're going to have a million challenges, but you can overcome them. Even though that person talking didn't have those challenges and didn't overcome them. Then there's the participant-centered on-the-job training and the participant-centered related instruction, meaning like we don't let a lot of community colleges offer these certificate programs. Like you can get your BA, let's say in child development and family, blah, 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 whatever. You can also get a certificate in infant toddler care. But the courses you take for that infant toddler certificate are not degree applicable. They're in addition to the degree. Now, I think it should be part of the degree, but until it is, we say, no, you can offer it, but not as part of the apprenticeship. We're not having our students take a zillion child development courses that get them nowhere closer to a degree and avoid the classes like English or math that they're so scared about, which makes it impossible to get the degree. So when I talk about participant-centered related instruction, the issue is how do you structure it? How do you support it so that they can succeed at these barriers that can be really daunting? One of the other structures we put in place that is not a part of the apprenticeship system is the cohort, which turns out to be really important. That the social and intellectual and professional networking that goes on when you have a cohort. We've done panels of apprentices over and over again. And one thing you always hear is that their friends in the cohort are the ones who kept them from quitting. Not because they necessarily were going, oh, you can do it. It was more like they were saying, if I'm not quitting, you're not quitting. So just let's take a breath. That's really important if you are trying to do something that's very difficult and you're a mother and you've never been to college before, and you're working full time and so forth. So and we have this whole chart of like 16 different things, but it gives you a sense of the kind of elements of program design that go beyond those 5 required things that I talked about at the beginning. This is just putting meat on the bones of a really good skeleton.
And I mean, I think this really illustrates and speaks to why having a sector-based intermediary and really also serving as kind of that field builder role is really critical because you're bringing in so much of the kind of research and documentation around what are those supports that help early educators specifically be successful in education training, higher ed programs, and then coupling that with the on-the-job trainings, which traditionally has not been
coupled.
And I have to give a yes, thank you, amen to not having folks take so many credits that don't go anywhere, right? They can be valuable in their own way, but not valuable towards that degree that we know is really critical for folks to be working towards. So
And just to mention real quickly, the idea of contextualized courses, because, and that's a stretch. It's not a stretch in principle. It's a stretch to get community colleges to be able to do that. Because I think there's a lot of instructors who'd love to do that when they're not allowed. They're sort of basically not allowed to. But if you have someone who's taking a math course and it's math for early childhood, which by definition goes up to 3rd grade. So we're talking about, learning to count, but it goes way beyond that. If the math is all about, and it's logical, if you're going to be working with 0 to 8 year olds, There's a lot of math you need to understand, and you need to understand how do you learn math? And why is playing in a bathtub with those little plastic things that go on the bathtub, why is that part of learning to read, right? All those little things. If you have insight about that, you are a treasure. And learning math that really is irrelevant to what you're going to do for a living makes no sense. And it makes no sense for any industry, but I'm not worrying about other industries at the moment.
That's right. And so I think given all of this, it's clear that like standing up an apprenticeship in ECE, like it's not plug and play, right? You have to really understand the context of an individual community, because that's also going to vary across, even within a state, but certainly across the country. As you said, like where are programs? Where are the employers that you're partnering with? Who are the other businesses? What's the nature of the higher ed, systems that you're connecting to? Um, so it's definitely not plug and play. And, it takes intention and it takes investment, an investment of money, an investment of people's time to, build these partnerships and develop these access resources and supports. And so for folks who are listening today who might be worried about building up an apprenticeship, a registered apprenticeship program, but be facing a fiscal cliff or shifting policy landscapes, political context. Are there strategies for building an apprenticeship system that can outlast, a single grant or budget or political cycle?
Okay, so this is a big one, right? So we already talked about the idea that it's not a magic bullet. Sometimes people come to us and they go, "We're going to do apprenticeship." It's because they are under the delusion that there's money available. Some of them think that the Department of Labor is just overflowing with funding that they can't figure out where to send fast enough. And I just will tell you right now, that's just not true. Specifically, right now, it's not true. But even 5 years ago, even when was more funding. So that's number one. Don't do this because you think you can take what you already have, call it an apprenticeship, and voila, you have funding. It just doesn't work that way. Number two, you do have to learn how to talk outside of ECE to funders, to apprentice. Everybody in the country has to work with their apprenticeship office, whether it's a state apprenticeship agency or a DOL office of apprenticeship. You have to be able to talk to them when they say, well, you don't pay well, we're not going to work with you. You have to know the talking points, so you have to become an advocate. And let me just mention two things about that, and then I'm going to go to much more specifically your question about falling off a fiscal cliff and all that. What do you do about that? But the two things I want to mention is the sort of a quick primer on how do you address the wage issue. And this is it. You start by saying we don't have a wage issue. We have a funding issue. When we solve the funding issue, the wage issue will be part of that. And the funding issue is we are not publicly funded. And if all schools were private and if all community colleges were private, we would have a funding issue there too. I've never worked in a Catholic school, but from what I understand, they don't pay well. And I think that's a good example of what happens if you don't have public funding, sustainable public funding. So you need to learn to be able to talk about that and advocate for that while also saying, yes, but these are real, well, I have to say, these days it's getting a little easier because I don't know about you, even if you don't like to watch the news, the minute you watch any of it and anybody talks about affordability, I mean, childcare is mentioned over and over and over. It feels like, whoa, when did everybody wake up? So that's a whole nother conversation about meeting this particular moment. So that's the first thing is about understanding how to disarm people of that huge amount of assumptions and misconceptions. The second piece of it is this question of quality jobs. And what I like to explain to people is when you look up research on quality jobs, there's usually like 6 or 7 qualifications, and including things like opportunities for advancement within your job or within your institution. being part of a respectful and inclusive environment, feeling like you're having a meaningful impact. When you look at those lists, ECE checks every single one. They don't necessarily check good wages and benefits. So I was on a call webinar. This was during COVID, so it tells you it's a good number of years. And Julie Sue, who used to be our Secretary of Labor here in not called the Secretary of Labor, but that's what she was in California, and then went on to be the acting Secretary of Labor at the DOL, and now is working in New York City with Mamdani about all kinds of stuff. She was leading this, or she was part of the call, and they were talking about quality jobs. And I said, if quality jobs is just another way of saying high earning potential, then let's say that. Because by saying quality jobs, that's not just about earning potential. And I gave my little speech, what I just said just before. And when I was done, Julie said, you're right. We will only measure our success by the determinants we have identified. And if the only thing we look at is earning potential, then every industry is going to be evaluated according to its earning potential and nothing more. So we have to broaden our determinants of success and our definition of quality jobs. That's an important conversation. And I'm going to get the statistics wrong, but just maybe a month ago, there was an article in the New York Times, I think, about, I think it was the construction industry. I should really double check, has the highest suicide rate of like any industry. Okay, that's a really big determinant of success. I don't think ECE is suffering from a high suicide rate. They may be suffering from like exhaustion, you know, overwork. But anyway, so that's the other piece of how do you, the other thing you have to think about as you try and face the reality of the soup you're in and keep moving forward. Okay, which gets to the last part of your question. So there's this great quote that I love, which is luck is when preparation meets opportunity. It's a Greek philosopher whose name I can't remember. It sounds like Sadaka, like Neil Sedaka, but it's not. It's something. I will look it up and send you an email. Anyways, but what it means is success is rarely just random chance. Rather, it's the result of continuous hard work, skill development, and readiness. That's the preparation, aligned with a favorable moment or circumstance. And that's the opportunity. So that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. And I think that's the thing we have to think about when we're worried about the current moment or the fact that we just got, some state just got a new governor and childcare is no longer going to be a priority, or, any number of the country goes to war and suddenly money is going in a different direction, any number of cliffs that we're facing. In the interim, you get ready. You start doing the work, even if it's on a small scale. You start showing success and competence. You start establishing a reputation, and you start establishing relationships. So that people start to know, wow, there is this program going on and their results are impressive. And success begets success. When you get one grant from some small foundation and you show some success, other foundations start to say, wait a minute, well, we don't want to be left behind. They all want in on a success story. And so what I would say to people on this call is you have to do the work. You have to build a record of success and establish credibility. So when there is funding, when there are resources, and when opportunities come along, we're ready. Mic drop.
I love it. Thank you. And one other thread that I just want to pull out that you said, I want to make sure people don't lose, is really about redefining quality jobs, right? And how that's defined, and that a piece of that is absolutely wages and benefits. It's not the only piece. So ensuring that these other components are there, and we, aligning that with the good job principles and being able to speak to what we do have so that communities can tap into those resources. Um, I think is really critical. Bringing in resources like the model work standards to help early educators and communities that are working to do this talk about what good workplaces look like and what they are and how they exist in these other aspects and how apprenticeship contributes to that, I think is really critical. So
And,
I'm not
and
going to
then
try. Yep.
let me just, because I missed 2 points I should have made, which is in terms of the stuff you're going to hit when you start getting involved in the apprenticeship community. There's two things that are really important to us and our success that you have to learn how to fight for. One is there are huge groups, especially unions, who don't want there to be such a thing as stackable apprenticeships. Because in a union model, if you're trying to become a carpenter, you enter an apprenticeship, you have a journey person who's guiding you, you finish it, and you become a carpenter. And so somebody asked me years ago, well, why can't you just have one apprenticeship for ECE? They start wherever they start, and then they can keep going as far, they can get on the train where they need to and get off the train. I said, because you can't sell a program that's going to take 6 years to someone who's never been to college and say, well, if you stick with it, you'll get a BA degree. But you can say this particular program takes 18 months, and here's the we're going to give you a mentor, we're going to give you a success coordinator, you're going to get a laptop, it's not going to cost you anything. And at the end of those first 4 college courses, you're going to have a permit that makes you job ready. And then you can go on if you want to. That you can sell. And then they seamlessly go from one to the next, and then they go beyond that. So that's one thing we have to be able to sell. And the other thing is people will say, again, I had big fights when I was on the Secretary of Labor's advisory committee on apprenticeship and representing ECE to all these other sectors. And there were people who simply didn't want low wage jobs to be part of the apprenticeship system. You shouldn't even be apprenticeable if you're not. And it wasn't just ECE, it was like entry level, is it CNAs, certified nursing assistants? It was a lot of really important jobs, but it was sort of like, no, apprenticeship should just be for again, so you can make money quick. And one of the things, and this is part of also talking about wages, we do have a wage issue, there's no question, but it's a sub issue of the funding issue, right? But the biggest part of the wage issue is at entry level. Because people who are directors or lead teachers or who have gone on to be community college instructors or, public policy people, there are many things in the ECE career ladder options that pay way beyond minimum wage. And so we also have to start explaining you're not funding a low wage industry. You're funding an essential industry which is facing a funding issue that is not of our doing. So let's talk about your economy or our economy. But you're also talking about an industry that has a pathway. And we're giving people the opportunity to, what's the word that means not access? What's that word that means to go higher? To ascend on that pathway. And then they will be making family sustaining wages. And so that's the other point for people to make. I suspect nobody on this call is getting paid minimum wage, and yet many of us have had long careers in ECE.
All right. Well, I think that we are at a place to end as we're in our last couple of minutes here. I'm not going to sneak in my last questions that I had. Thank you, Randy, and thank you for those who joined to hear this discussion. I really hope it sparked something in your own work, maybe shed some new light or a different angle on apprenticeship and how you might be thinking about it. And Randy, I don't know if you want to say what's next for this webinar or if there's anything related to ESEP's activities that you wanted to share before we wrap up.
I'll tell you the thing. Well, our national conference starts on Tuesday, but we're basically full. But if you're really tenacious, we might be able to squeeze you in. You can email at us at eseps@eseps.org. Oh, and they just put in the chat box the link to the ESEP's Journey, the paper that Leah referenced to begin with. But the other news I will tell you is our brand new website launched yesterday. So I would encourage you to go take a look. All of the resources we have ever developed, every video, every printed resource, every flyer, it's really well organized and user-friendly, but it is completely redesigned and thorough. And so if you want to know about upcoming boot camps, additional deep dive webinars that are after Apprenticeship Week and so forth, It's all on the website. And thank you, Leah, for your years of association and collegiality and support and encouragement of our work. I so appreciate you.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.